Okay, this is a continuation of the BMW e26 documentary. The last part, what we did was we talked about removing the fenders, the two quarter panels and the hood, the grille, the bumper, and the headlights. So at this point in time, what we've done is we've replaced all of those parts and we had the car painted. So you could see here the car has been painted with a Boston green, which is the color of the car. The hood assembly is on. See a nice finish on the hood. And I'll close the hood in a second so you can see all the lines on the car. And I'll point out a couple things when I do that. So there you go. That's what the car looks like now. I'll take a couple of extra shots of it in just a moment. Okay, just resuming. So this is a picture of the car with the hood down. A couple of things to point out. Getting the lines right on the hood was a challenge because I did have a little front end damage, as I pointed out in a prior video. But I was able to get everything lined up as best I could. One thing I did have a problem with is lining up the hood attachment points, and in one of the prior videos you noticed, or I noted that I couldn't get it out. So the answer to that is I had to bring it to the place where I had the car painted, and I actually used a air tool to hammer jack out the bottom of the attachment of the hood, and we put a new one in. So that's one problem with these cars. If the hood cable, if it gets stretched, don't force it. And if your hood gets stuck closed, make sure you use two people to get the hood open. So anyway, that's what the car looks like now. Take a step back and close it out. Okay, today's objective is to replace the springs on the front of the car. This is a 1994 BMW e26, and you can see I've got the car jacked up, and the objective here is to get the wheel off, and we're going to replace these springs in here with the springs that I purchased from Turner Auto Sports. So we have the front springs, which are these two right here, and we have rear springs. So this car has 180,000 miles on it, and we've already taken care of the struts. So I'm going to take the struts out, replace the spring on the strut, put it back in, and show you what that looks like. So here we go. Okay, a couple things. One is to get the strut out. I've done a couple things. One is I've secured the hub using this little contraption that goes up over the fender and to my garage wall. So that keeps the hub from hanging. Second is these are 18 millimeter or, yes, 18. So there are three primary nuts and bolts that support the strut. Top here, there's a nut that goes through. It looks like this. Goes across, and then you have a backing nut. Then you have two additional ones on the bottom here. See if I can get that. And so that's the bottom part of the strut. And then to get the top part of the strut out, there are three nuts. And I have no idea what size this is. Probably like a 14 millimeter. My eyes are going bad, so. Okay, here we are. A couple of things I'll point out in taking out the strut. Number one is you do want to support the hub. I've got this little assembly with the rope going over the fender onto my garage there. Best thing I can come up with. Second, there are three nuts that hold the top of the strut into the body of the car. These are 13 millimeter nuts, so you're going to want to have that ready to go. And then the bottom here, the lower part of the strut is held on by three bolts, and one bolt with a nut. All of them are 18 millimeters. The top portion has this type of nut and bolt arrangement that goes through that right there, and then there are two attachment points on the rear of the hub that are 18 millimeters. So everything's ready to go. I'm going to now pull the strut out. Okay, I've now released the strut from the top, and you can see I pulled away the hub, so now the strut is freely released. One thing I did not note is you need to take out off of the strut all of these. One's the ABS, one's the brake sensor, and then one's the hydraulic fluid line that goes into the brake cylinder. The brake pads here. So you can see down here you have the upper part of the strut and the lower. Everything's pretty free. So now I think I can just take this out right now. So I'm going to do that. And success. So we just removed the strut. Just got to be careful when you're taking the strut out that you avoid contact in the body. So you can see here, the strut fits into the top of the well, and you can see the 3 bolts, holes for the bolts, and all of this is freely hanging. You have the control arm here, which has bushing in the back. It has attachment point on the frame here and attachment point on the hub here. I've replaced all of that. So there you go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take apart the strut to remove this spring, and we're going to put a new spring in. And that's our next step. I'll tell you something about how to really make sure you do the strut right. This is a 94 e26 strut. On the strut you have in the top here a 22 millimeter nut, and then you have a 7 millimeter hex hole here. So what people try to do is they put a vice grip around the strut shaft, which is a no-no, because that thing needs to freely go up and down and not have any marks that could damage the internal strut mechanism. So what you do here is, this is a neat trick I learned, or you take the 7 millimeter, you stick that sucker in the top there, then you take the 22 millimeter, go over the top, and then you use an extender like this. You go into that 7 millimeter hex wrench, and then, now I don't have my vice grips, I need to get them, but the idea is you put a vice grip around this, and then this is how you loosen that nut. The other very important thing that you need to do is you need to have spring compressors. So I have a set, you can get them at any auto store, but basically you'll need to compress the spring before you do any loosening of the nut on the top. Otherwise you won't get that sucker back on. Anyway, so that's the key thing. So what we're going to do now is disassemble the strut, take out the spring, put the new spring on, and I might even make a run to Napa to get a new top bearing. This one is a little old, so it's always good to change them if you can. Alright, so that's a key thing that you should know about changing a strut on a BMW. Okay, so what I've done is, this is the top part of the strut, which holds the spring down. This is the bottom part. This goes on top here. So what I wound up doing is I didn't get a vice grip. I let the spring tension this, and I was able to unscrew this nut off of the top here. So that was good. So I guess the important thing here is this sits on the top there with this nut inside. The spring is compressed, so you have to keep track of everything. That's why I'm documenting this right now. So number one is the cap comes off, and that's the bottom. Those are bearings in there. Then there is a washer that goes between these guys, so you want to make sure that that's there. Washer, and then this comes right off the top. Okay, so that is the spring. Now what I ought to be able to do is just kind of lift this spring out. You can see it's nice and loose right now. So I'm going to just take the spring out. There you go. And that's the spring compressed. That's the strut assembly. And if you buy a strut from Bilstein or BMW, you're going to get that whole piece there. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can find a replacement cap and then clean this up a little bit and then put it all back together. And then I have the other side to do. Alright, there you go. I hope this is helpful. Surely helps me because I need to document what I do on the car so I can figure out how to put it all back together. I'm not a mechanic, but I like tinkering with cars, and that's the car that we tinker with. There we go. Okay, here is the strut fully assembled. Actually, it's not fully assembled, but this is the strut for a BMW e26. You can see the cap here, which goes under the body. I replaced that so it's new. You have the spring assembly, and then what comes in the middle, which you don't get, that you need to get, is a dampener, meaning that if you bottom out, you protect the base of the strut from cracking, because the strut itself is filled with oil. So we're going to assemble this. A couple of key things about the assembly. One is I'm going to use a spring compression tool, which is this right here, to compress the spring so that I'm able to get the nut into that post. And then a couple of key things on installing. One is there's a 7mm hex drive that goes into the top of the strut post to prevent it from turning while you're turning the screw. One technique I found is that you can get the springs compressed and then get the nut on and then uncompress the springs, and then that will put enough tension to allow you to screw the nut on and tighten it. So I'm going to try that, see how it goes, and if necessary I'll use the 7mm insert as well to really get a good tight set on it. Okay, so that's the strut. Looks good, and we're going to go ahead and take care of doing all that work that I mentioned. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to teach you a little trick here. So remember I told you that the internal post spins. So here's how you do this. What you do is you basically take a 7mm hex wrench, goes into the top of the hex bolt. That's the top of the very strut. Then you have this 22mm socket that goes around the nut, and you can see I have an extension coming out to this wrench on the top. Then I'm going to take a vice grip and go around the socket, and I'm going to hold the top and turn the nut, and that's how you do that. You never want to put a vice grip on that post because you will find that you could damage the post and it will damage the strut. So that's a trick that you can use to assemble and disassemble a strut. There you go. Okay, we're going to now install the strut into the left side. So you can see the strut, it's got everything on it. Everything's torqued down nicely. So the strut will come inside here, attached to this bolt here. Make it so you can see. So there's 3 bolts, 1, 2, 3, and then it goes right up into the bottom of the chassis. And of course I have all of these things. Now one trick that I use is you just kind of suspend the hub of the wheel using a rope or a wire so it doesn't hang loosely. So what we're going to do is first insert the strut onto this, so that's a pivot point. Bring it up, put it right into the body up there, and then attach on the top of the body here one bolt to keep it secure. We'll make sure it's a nice fit, and then put everything in. And then that will take care of the left side, and I'll do the same exact thing on the right. By the way, for safety, always have a jack stand underneath the body of the car, and don't just leave a jack there. You'll read that in all kinds of instructions. Okay, so there we go, and we'll get started right now.